Okay, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. Firstly, sorry for being a little late. I will apologize. I will not apologize, though, because Thomas Dimitroff is the biggest show in town right now. He's getting all kinds of calls. I'm getting a few calls, not as many, nearly as many as Thomas, but Thomas is wheeling and dealing over here, taking plenty of, prospective, and it's funny. I get DMs asking for people to interview Thomas this week. And I'm like, look, he's getting a lot of calls. So we're sorry we're about a half hour, 40 minutes or so late, but I guarantee you this is going to be an amazing show today. But before we talk, Thomas, about all of the interesting news, it was not a black Monday. It was a black Wednesday, Tuesday and Wednesday. I do want to direct everybody's gaze for a second to our playoff preview, Thomas, which is an amazing piece of work by our data scientist, Tej, Seth, Sean Syed, one of our basically our editor-in-chief, as well as our designer, Lucy Kent. If you go to sumersports.com/playoff preview, you can look at our playoff preview. It is an amazing piece of work. You do have to subscribe to our website, but it is free, and it's a fantastic piece of work. So please go ahead and do that for us. I also am wearing my Big Data Bowl quarter zip in honor of the fact that everybody submitted their Big Data Bowl stuff. Shout out to Michael Lopez, who runs that for the NFL. Back to the real news here. Mike Vrabel fired yesterday by the Tennessee Titans. And then today, Pete Carroll, relieved of his duties. Now, they amicably ended his tenure, 14 years, as the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. Wow. Right. We remarked on it Monday, a very tame Monday, Thomas, but a not tame middle of this week. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I mean, I feel like I'm on a zip line back and forth throughout Buckhead and Atlanta here, back every which way across buildings. I mean, it's unbelievable. The traffic, the discussions, the calls, the interest. So the reason that's happening for people like myself who are formerly in a role like that, a lot of our guys are either still in jobs, right, are holding GM jobs, or those of us who have moved on are on the periphery, very interested in what's happening, not only for themselves getting back in, but for some of their people that they're trying to help. You know what I'm saying? Some of the people that were with guys like John Robinson and Tom Telesco and Jerry Reese, whoever it may be. Everyone's very keyed in this year. There's a lot of discussion about it. I'm quite amazed at how it is. Not that they're looking for anyone to get fired. That's not what they're talking about. It's more when the dust settles, what's the next direction? And that's where there's a lot of discussion. So I think it's really important to understand that. I will say I just got off the phone with Rod Graves. He's the head of the Fritz Pollard Alliance. If you guys remember Rod used to be a longtime personnel man before he was a longtime GM in the league with the Cardinals, long time with the Bears. Great football man, great person, in charge of the Fritz Pollard, really in charge of what's going on with the underprivileged opportunities out there. And, I would say underrepresented, not underprivileged, underrepresented. And I think for Rod right now, we were having a great discussion about who are the underrepresented GMs out there, because I want to lead in on this, and the head coaches, right? You see a lot out there when you start talking about guys like Ian Cunningham and Brandon Brown, Will McClay, who's been at Dallas for a long time. Will could go somewhere in a heartbeat and take a team over. He's just so comfortable where he is in Dallas right now. It'll be interesting to see where those guys are. Terrence Gray's getting a lot of discussion. He's up in Buffalo. So you talk about that on the GM side. And if you don't mind, and then I'll turn it back to you because we can start in a lot of different areas. But I love to see that Raheem Morris on the coaching side, he's getting a lot of discussion and a lot of interest in where he is, right?
Well, and I like that one as well because, he had his time in Tampa Bay, and you were against him when you were with the Falcons. He had his chance at the plate in, I believe, 09, 10, and 11 before he was let go and relieved for Greg Schiano. And, he had a 10-6 season. It wasn't good enough to make the playoffs, but he had some success bounced around a little bit. He was with you actually in Atlanta at the very end of your tenure there. He goes to LA, takes over for Brandon Staley, wins the Super Bowl, pushed a lot of the right buttons there. A lot of people, and this is one thing where I get a little irritated at people online. A lot of people will like to degrade what he did in LA because they had so much talent there. But there's a lot of coaches that will squander talent and not win Super Bowls when they have it. And so I do like seeing, guys like him. Now, one I'm a little bit just, and you see guys like him. I think Ejiro Evero, he's going to be interviewing for the job in Carolina, where he's currently the defensive coordinator. He's going to get a shot as well. So yeah, there are going to be guys, I think, that are going to get opportunities that are from underrepresented groups to get head coaching jobs in the league. And that's awesome. Thomas Brown, again, offensive coordinator for the Philadelphia Eagles, is getting an opportunity to interview around the league as well. They have a game Monday against Tampa Bay. That complicates things a little bit, but again, another opportunity there as well.
Again, very important to kind of set the tone and the scene for that underrepresented group, because this is a really interesting year, and to see where the league is going to go and how are they going to do the right thing to make sure they're placing the right people in the right jobs. And again, we're just talking about Raheem Morris. You can talk about, hey, do not cash this idea that people would stop talking about Eric Bieniemy. Steve Wilkes is another name along with Eric Bieniemy. These are quality football coaches who definitely needs. The other guy that came up, by the way, let me just say this. Then I'll stop at the 4. I'm excited about it only because there are people out there that are also talking about David Shaw. I know David Shaw ended up at Stanford the way that he did. David's unbelievably versed in so many different ways. He's been around football all his life. Point is, good group of guys. They need to continue to fulfill what's needed in the league.
Well, one last name, actually, which was surprising because he's still a candidate for his own job in Las Vegas, but Antonio Pierce was requested an interview for the Titans job, which was just open. And I want to talk about that one situation now we've talked about your past discussions with Rod Graves, which was the surprising firing of Mike Vrabel. So Mike Vrabel was 54-45 as the coach of the Titans. We talked about this a little bit last year. You can go through the archives of the show. But the Titans last season were 7-3 when they fired John Robinson, their general manager. They finished the season after firing John. They finished the season 0-7. And then this season they went 6-11. So since firing him, they've been 6 and, carry the 2, 6-18. And, obviously that's not great. And, Vrabel's time in Tennessee is basically littered with overachievement, right? In 2021, they played the most players in NFL history, meaning they're the most active players. And then they got the 1 seed in the AFC. Now they bowed out in their first game after having the bye. So they've never really reached the pinnacle, but they always overachieved. And yet at the same time, they were always left wanting more, I think, a little bit at times. And so at first they blamed it on the general manager. And after that happened, they've lost a bunch of games. And so now they're blaming it on the head coach, and he's gone. So they're left now with Rand Carthon and a hole at head coach and a roster that I think charitably has some work to do, right? And so the new head coach that's going to come in not only has to work with Rand on building a new culture, but also building that roster up. They have a quarterback now in Will Levis who showed some potential this year. I wouldn't say he blew the doors off of anybody, but he certainly showed some potential, a really lively arm. I would say out of the rookies that played this season, he's probably the 3rd best guy. What's your take on this? It was very surprising yesterday.
Surprising. Again, hell of a coach. We know that. Leader of men, all of that stuff, but I'll go back to, Amy Strunk, right? Amy Adams Strunk. Isn't that how we
maybe.
But what I'm saying is, make no mistake about it. That organization prior to that move last year with John Robinson, they were full and laden with a lot of football talent at leadership between both of those guys. Whether they've left, whether they're, John's in between right now, John Robinson, he is a hell of a football man and a hell of an evaluator and a hell of a builder. And the head coach who just got fired is a hell of a football coach. Okay, what does that mean? It means that in this league, it's not like it ever has been. And there's going to be more and more circulating and moving around. The thing that I find really interesting is, the ownership there, they made a strong decision. There's a reason that they're in the situation they're in right now. The only thing that I'm surprised about, and I would love to hear, Tennessee's ownership, the group, not just the owner herself, but her group, talk about, sort of why, in fact, they didn't work harder to trade Mike Vrabel. It's a commodity there because he is one of the sought after coaches, right? Right now, in my mind, it's a really, really interesting this year more than ever. There's the old style coaches, not older coaches, but experienced coaches. Dan Quinn's a hot name right now. Mike Vrabel is going to be a hot name right now. Jim Harbaugh, well, he's coming from where he's coming. What happens, who knows what happens there, right? But what is a team like Tennessee going to do? Who are they going to be better with this year replacing Mike Vrabel? That's what they have to decide.
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think that where they're coming from, you look at, so take a step back. It's funny because I know, a fair amount of people from the AFC South or that used to be in the AFC South, and I would go to their games, I'd stand on the sideline and I'd be like, what do you think about this year? And they'd always say the same thing. All the teams, right? All the teams, Colts, Texans, Titans, they'd all say, I like our division, and I think for the first time, if you're the Tennessee Titans, you don't like your division. The Colts, they're 9-8. Right. And they got a quarterback, big, fast, strong, pretty damn good coming up. He's coming off an injury, but you've got a good coach, good quarterback. That's going to be tough. Houston, good coach, good quarterback. That's going to be a tough thing to go up against. Jacksonville, I know that they've kind of imploded at the end of the season, but they have a quarterback that we all think is pretty good and a coach that's won a Super Bowl before. If you're the Titans and you're thinking, okay, it's kind of like the Belichick thing, right? Where you're thinking you got a pretty good coach, a guy that everybody thinks is good. You have a roster that's not like ready to compete right now. Do you really want to rebuild with a guy who maybe doesn't necessarily have the patience? Like for Rand Carthon, it's a multiple year thing, isn't it? Right. And if you maybe are, if you're trying to build a process, right? If you're Rand Carthon, how many, this, right? You were a one-time general manager, right? You were 13 years, but you've been one-time general manager. If you're Rand Carthon, you're like, statistically, I get one shot at this. I'm going to do it my way. And you got a head coach who is reportedly like a very opinionated guy. He does it his way. That's going to cause friction. Like, don't you think?
Yes. And so now you're sitting there with Rand in his second year as a general manager, right? Still very young in that job, though, a good football mind. We know that, beside the point. Now you have to think about where is ownership at Tennessee? What do they do? Let's scenario this because I like scenarios. What if they decide to go after a guy like Bobby Slowick, right? Mm-hmm. Or another younger coach that doesn't have a ton of experience? More than likely, they're going to probably pull someone in there who might have been a first-time head coach. What is ownership going to do there? Do they go out and literally, no offense to Rand at all, but do they go out and look for an over-the-top presidential situation to be able to help, Rand navigate through some of what some of these people have done? I'm talking about guys out there who might it be? It could be, Jerry Reese. It could be, former general managers out there, Rick Smith. There are people out there that could bond really well with Rand Carthon.
Rick Spielman type. I know he's with Washington now, but like that kind of guy.
Help him get settled because there's a lot on Rand's plate right now. You can only imagine. And so if you had a young head coach and a younger general manager and you have an owner who's, she's still feeling her way around after, over the years, that in all due respect to her, like, what is she going to do? Who is she bringing in to bolster that moving forward? That's going to be interesting.
Well, and that person can kind of like, it's really hard sometimes where you're like let's be honest, like when you draft a quarterback, and I know they have a Levis, but like let's be honest, they probably should hedge Levis with a different quarterback, and then you bring in, like, let's say you bring in a guy like Slowick, right? Because the way I see it, like, look at Houston. Houston was on the brink of getting some people, like Houston was sort of always on the brink, right? And then they get the right quarterback, they get the right kind of coach, and now they're in a good place, right? And you need somebody who can kind of be that buffer between ownership and the GM to kind of explain what the process is, because the person who is kind of the architect of the process may not be necessarily the best person to be the salesperson of the process to the ownership all the time.
So as we're moving through this, and I know we have a few to jump to, I think in the end, just like we would pick our teams, who's your ideal choice for the head coaching job at these places? Even though I mentioned Bobby Slowick as one that I'm sure they would be considering, young guy, et cetera, they don't want at least in my opinion, after Mike Vrabel's era, a really power strong guy. Maybe they want someone who's going to be more suitable, that's going to interact well with Rand and interact well with ownership and understanding that. My choice for that, Dan Quinn.
Yeah, Dan Quinn's strong. He's also like patient.
Exactly. Yeah.
He has, he like from what I can tell, he's going to have that patience. If you're looking for an offensive, person, Ben Johnson, Eric Bieniemy has, there's a chance there. If you're looking on the defensive side of the ball, Mike McDonald, Lou Anarumo, Lou Anarumo's defense kind of fell apart this year, but it was very good previous years. Those kind of people are. I don't think it can be. I think Dan Quinn's kind of the perfect one because he's established, but he's not like, and I don't know him as well as you do, but he's not the Belichick, ego. He's not the Belichick. He's not going to come in and they're not going to be the Arizona Cardinals, Buddy Ryan billboard guy, right? You know what I mean?
But he's going to come in back to, in lieu of bringing someone in, a president, and trying to fit that in. You have Rand, who understands football through and through, as a guy who's been raised in it because his dad was a coach in the league. And then you bring a guy like Dan in. So there's your experienced person along with Rand, two football guys that I think that would be good. I'm not saying they shouldn't bring in a young person. I think it's more the personality that's going to be important about how that.
But it has to be somebody with a long-term vision of that team, like a D'Amico Ryans last year with Houston. Because think about Houston, right? Houston went David Culley, right, 1 year, Lovie Smith one. Like, it had to be somebody that was a Houston Texan, like D'Amico Ryans, that was going to be there for a long time, and that's where I think some people get worried, because you're like, that guy has to be there for a long time and has to be there. And so I do think, like, the next place Dan Quinn goes, he's going to be there for 5 years. Like that's the vibe I get. And so to me, that's a good spot. Do we want to move on to Seattle? Because that just happened.
Yep.
Pete Carroll, by the way, was the Minnesota Vikings defensive backs coach.
Throw it up.
Was my age when I was born. He was 170 and 120 and 1 as the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. He was 137, 89 and 1 overall. He won one Super Bowl. He lost one Super Bowl as the head coach of the Seahawks. He also was the head coach of the Jets for 1 year and the head coach of the Patriots for 3. He's actually the last head coach of the Patriots. So before Belichick. So that's kind of crazy. He was let go, they amicably just agreed to part ways. He's going to be a front office consultant as of right now. That one's interesting, right? Like, it's kind of a team. They have Geno Smith kind of on a mid-tier contract, so he's their quarterback. The defense is kind of whatever right now. Offensive line, it's not Tennessee. Like, this team can compete. So whoever comes in is going to have a roster that can compete in the NFC, but it's also not a juggernaut, and it's also not terrible. So it's kind of a different situation than Tennessee.
So you have John Schneider. Speaking of the whole layout, John's been there a long time as well. One of my contemporaries. I have a great deal of respect for how he builds football teams. He's been through the ups and downs of it all in a positive way. He and Pete have weathered some storms and always come out on the other side because, they're resilient. So knowing that you have a really sound individual in the management area there, in the general manager area, who understands player personnel through and through, I think you have at least as ownership, you have the freedom or the scope to say, okay, this is not the Dan Quinn show. Forgive me, and I love Dan, of course, but I'm not just here to pump Dan. But Dan is the obvious number one choice there as well, because Dan and John Snyder have a very, very good working relationship, and Dan loves personnel. John loves personnel. So that's one way you could go there, which I think would be ideal. The other way I think you could go there is back to John being in the business a long time. John may pull someone in there that's sort of younger, and they're looking to inject the youthful side of all of this. Who do you think that might be? Who would fit that situation given their personnel from a data standpoint in your mind, besides like Dan Quinn? Like, what would be the younger?
One important detail of this is Seattle has opened up. So one difference, and this is important, and I don't think people understand, so Carolina has not released any of the assistants coaches, whereas Seattle has released all assistant coaches to be interviewed, right? So, Shane Waldron, for example, is the offensive coordinator. He is allowed to interview with whoever he wants to right now, whereas that's not true about Carolina. So, that's an interesting one. I think when it comes to Seattle up there, you think about a guy like Ben Johnson. You think about like Mike McDonald could go up there. You think about moving out with that defense. Think about Jordan Brooks, kind of a linebacker who is of a similar ilk to Roquan Smith, a guy that, Mike McDonald is sort of supercharged in that defense in Baltimore, the number one seed in the AFC with Patrick Queen up there. They have Devin Witherspoon, who kind of has kind of a Kyle Hamilton slot role in Baltimore. Like, I'm kind of thinking about personnel and who would match with that personnel. Mike McDonald's really close to one of my friends, Corey Krawick, who is, he's one of that data edifice that's in Baltimore that has really supercharged that franchise. I like to look at who are some of the well-run programs in the NFL. It's Baltimore, it's Kansas City, it's Cleveland, Philadelphia. I like to look at those programs and see where those guys are coming from. And Detroit's another one. That's why I looked at Ben Johnson, people like that. And so that's why I'm always looking at guys like Mike McDonald, even though he's a defensive guy, and it's always a little bit different that way. Dallas is another place, and that's why Dan Quinn is always an obvious choice, because Dallas is run the right way, right? And so, those are always names that come up for me.
What if, here's the what if Jerry Jones, what if that happened? They're looking and they're like, we can't lose Dan. We've kept Dan around here. Dan has stayed here. What if the obvious happens? What if he's faced with a really, really tough situation? How does that play out?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time, Thomas, that a Green Bay Packers Super Bowl head coach went to the Pacific Northwest and coached Seattle, right? Yeah. We know Mike Holmgren went from Green Bay, and obviously, Mike Holmgren didn't stop in Dallas first, but, and again, I don't want to speculate, and we have not speculated on the show. We wanted to respect people's humanity for sure, but that is something I want to transition to now that we've talked about this week. I don't know if we're done yet, right? Because there have been rumors about Philadelphia. There have been rumors about Dallas, to your point, because, there's always that itch. And Jerry Jones fired a 2-time Super Bowl winning head coach after he won his second Super Bowl. They are itchy there. We also have the situation, we have other situations that could be tenuous as well. So, obviously New England is still up in the air with Belichick. He could stay, he could go, depending upon what could happen. But yeah, we could see Dan Quinn be the head coach in Dallas and Mike McCarthy be the head coach in Seattle. Those things could happen.
You're right in town here. I know we talked about Atlanta on Monday. And, look, you and I both said this. We were talking about it here. We were talking about really intelligent coaches. Arthur Smith is a really intelligent football coach. Unfortunately, it didn't work for him here. Does he ever get another chance and opportunity? Not at this point. Reason I bring this up now is, however, he has shown Arthur Blank once again, okay, we have a younger guy in here who was brought in to be the play caller and et cetera, et cetera. And now does that make Arthur less apt to go after, a Ben Johnson or a first-time coach because he's been through that? Honestly, I've been around this and I know that. Mike Smith, this goes back to me and him. Mike Smith, first-time head coach, wasn't supposed to get it. He got it. Dan Quinn comes in as a star factor. Everyone wanted him, but he was a first-time head coach. Arthur Smith was a first-time head coach. You go back to Arthur Blank's time, and he had, who was it? I'm just trying to think of Arthur Blank, to me, needs to really step back. Humbly, I'm saying this, not that I know what they're doing there. I got to be careful what I say, but look at those experienced coaches out there, right? Arthur's never really had that star coach, right? He's never had that guy come in and be the guy, right? Bobby Petrino maybe he was supposed to be that guy. Obviously, that was not the case.
Yeah, and that didn't work, right?
Remember, it was written that Bill Parcells got to the altar and said, I'm out. So this is a ripe time for a man like Arthur Blank, who honestly deserves to have a winner here. And I'll be interested to see how they approach it there. I wanted to bring that up only because, where does that go? Does Harbaugh is he really considered for a job like this in Atlanta or some of these teams? Does he even come out? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do agree. I think what's interesting is we are seeing kind of a big time dichotomy between the kind of CEO coach, right? We are seeing some of these CEO coaches, the Vrabels, the Carrolls, presumably the Belichicks, which again, we don't know that that's going to happen. Those guys are we're seeing and now we're seeing kind of the wonderkin, the Johnsons, the Mike McDonalds, who I mentioned previously. We're seeing those guys kind of, again, rise up a little bit. And I think that except for the truly elite guys, right? Because who have been some of the guys that have come up this year, first-time head coaches that have had success? DeMeco Ryans, he's, a lot of that success has been Bobby Slowick. Dan Campbell, a lot of that success has been Ben Johnson. Like, sometimes the head coach that has the success is the guy that delegates. And we find this out at work too, like at Sumer. I'm pretty good at data science, but I can't do data science that much anymore. I got to delegate. I showed you the playoff preview. Tej Seth did most of that work, right? Because I can't, I'm doing all this other stuff, right? We have to, and that's the whole, what gets you here is not what keeps you here. And that's true about coaching. That's true. How many times did you actually scout a player as a GM? Not that, you put your final touch on it, but you weren't scouting hundreds of players like you did when you were director of college scouting for the Patriots. And I think that's, people have to think long and hard about, has this guy done the job before? And that's true about the GM hires as well. And I think about, the guys that, some of these teams are considering, and it's has that guy at least seen this modeled before, right? Or have you consulted with somebody who's actually been a GM before?
Let me just correct one thing here. We do, as general managers, scout hundreds. I'm talking ones and twos. We no longer scout thousands. Or 5, 6, 7s, 8s. What I'm saying is, just so everyone knows, general managers in today's world, they get it to your point, they get it funneled down to them and broken down and basically by position, rankings and stackings. And then from there, the GM and the head coach really dig in to try to stack bust, what we call often, and continue to hone in on what is right for that organization. Very important distinction. It's not like GMs aren't doing their work. They are doing a lot of still putting their eyes on it. I know you weren't suggesting that. I'm just saying.
But you're also determining a ton of others. My point is you're doing a million other things, right? The offensive coordinator for the Lions is not determining whether or not you're going for fourth down or not, or determining whether or not, you're not taking the press conference telling whether or not the left guard is injured. You're calling the plays. And so if you're going to be a head coach and try to call the plays while doing all that other stuff, you might fail because, and that's where I get worried about some of these guys, because you're doing a million other things while trying to do the thing you were previously good at. And you have to sometimes give up the thing you were previously good at. And that might be a thing you love, right? And that's a tough thing. And that's one of the reasons why I found Ben Johnson taking a year to still call plays for Detroit somewhat refreshing, because maybe he wasn't ready in his own mind, right? And that, there are things and that's why I think your push on this show and in general for somebody in that kind of like presidential, tranche is refreshing, because somebody needs to be there to tell that general manager, like, hey, you're doing too much, or somebody's got to be there to counsel that person.
I think there's a really tactful, correct way to approach that if a team ever wanted to do that. And that, quite honestly, I've had this conversation with some owners, and I've had this conversation with a number of general managers and even presidents. If a president is over top of the head coach and the general manager, which oftentimes it is, not the guys like Bill Belichick or Andy Reid, that's different, of course. There are presidents in those organizations, but they're not over top, right? The president at Kansas City. You're a fan of what goes on at Kansas City. He's very mindful of where he is. He's not doing anything heavy-handed over Andy Reid, of course. But if you ever get a president in there that is literally in there to help work with the nuances of building the team, they need to be, in my mind, make sure that president coming in is tied to the successes of the head coach and the general manager. Mm-hmm. What happens if a president comes in there and he's got desires to be a football president and a czar? I'm not a real fan of that. I think it can get really ugly. Poor Dave Caldwell. I'm saying that for Dave. He'd hate me saying that. But when Tom Coughlin came down there, it got really dusty, right? You want to make sure that whoever comes in as that president or that overtop who has a lot of football background knows that they're there to help those two guys with ideas. They're there to mentor. They're there to throw suggestions out. They're not there to jam it down the head coach's or the GM's throat, right? Ultimately, as a president, it's being able to share the experiences and do some suggesting and mentoring. And again, to me, tie that contract of that president coming in to the two contracts. I know it sounds odd and a little counterintuitive, but make sure that the three of them are working together, and you don't have a president turning the corner every day taking shots at a coach or his GM. I think that's important.
Yeah, and let's lastly finish here this podcast, because I know we got tons of stuff to do, with like a non-news item. There's some news here, but the Bears have made the announcement that they were going to keep Matt Eberflus. Matt Eberflus is 10-24 in 2 seasons with the Bears. They have fired almost their entire offensive staff, though. And this is where it gets weird, right? Because presumably he's got like very short time, right? And the decision now is whether or not to draft Caleb Williams at 1, Caleb Williams or Drake May, depending upon who they prefer, or keep Justin Fields, and trade the pick, right? And, this is the Bears, right? The Bears, with John Fox, they had 1 year of Mitch Trubisky, they've kind of done this before. Does this add, is this good? And I don't mean for you to go and, but this is an awkward situation, yes, because you put kind of like boundaries that are not, like, you put timelines that are not linked together, right? Because, Eberflus and this new quarterback or Justin Fields, they're on timescales that are not linked, correct?
Correct. Now, remember, Kevin Warren, this is a really, really important time in his career as the guy, right? As the president of football operations with the Bears. There is no doubt in my mind, his mind is about, okay, let's find a savior at the offensive coordinator position. Personally, I think the person that a lot of people want is they would love to have Josh McDaniel in their world. They know, okay, maybe Josh has not been successful as a head coach. Everyone out there, Josh can be magical with quarterbacks, even middling quarterbacks.
Matt Jones.
Yeah, he can do really good things. Problem is, there's only one Josh McDaniel out there. Who's the next guy? Is it a guy like Cliff Kingsbury? Like, who do they go after if Josh McDaniel isn't necessarily available there? This is going to be something that Kevin Warren will have a lot on him going into this year. Now, if things don't work out now with this move, that president that was there before Kevin was there for, what was he there for? I don't know, 25, 20 plus years.
Long time.
Yeah. Yep. He was there a long time. So Kevin's got a really interesting first year and a half on his plate to show the fan base and the NFL that he can make the right decision here.
Yeah, it's an awkward situation that I think, bears monitoring because, I mean, look, I think, as we talked about on the podcast before, like Poles and Eberflus were kind of they came in together and they inherited Fields. They've stuck with Fields. Fields has not been a disaster, but he also hasn't necessarily made it a slam dunk to keep him. It'll be interesting to see what they do now with the first pick. They also have their own pick, which is a fairly high pick as well. So they had their roster, their defense played really well down the stretch. They held Green Bay to 17 points the other day, but they can only score 9. I think it's, in my opinion, I think that they should draft somebody pretty high, the quarterback high, if they, especially if they can't get a trade commensurate with last year. But we'll see. You and I will certainly get questions about that when we go to Super Bowl Radio Row. By the way, anybody who's listening to this, and if you will be at Super Bowl Radio Row, give us a shout via email or just on Twitter or whatever. We will certainly, if time permits, we will do your show at the Super Bowl. This has been a great podcast, Thomas. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. This has been fun. For Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show. Thank you all for coming.